Thank you so much for joining us for CBN NewsWatch AM from Graham. Ahead today, high-level international meetings in an attempt to diffuse the growing tensions over Ukraine, as new estimates show the devastation that could happen if Russia invades. The number of new COVID cases has plunged, so is the United States looking at a new normal where COVID is more like the flu, and what would that look like? Plus, with Iran's nuclear program growing, would Israel launch a strike to take it out? Israeli leaders say they don't want a war, but they may have no choice.
Unfortunately, we are dealing with a murderous regime that has so much blood on its hands that it's only seeking and hungry for more. And that's why it needs to be stopped.
We'll hear about Israel's options for attacking Iran's nuclear power and a safe home for single moms, a place that's showing Christians how to care for pregnant women in a country where abortion might be outlawed.
We knew we could take moms that already had current housing and that they were in a safe situation, and then bring them into a Bible study and a support group structure in our home. We would all cook meals together, send them home with the meals.
We'll bring you a look at ministries that could become more important than ever if Roe v. Wade is overturned and single mothers need help. All those stories and more are ahead today.
This is CBN NewsWatch.
Let's begin with the international efforts to defuse the standoff over Ukraine amid estimates that a Russian invasion could lead up to 50,000 civilian deaths, and Russia taking the Ukrainian capital of Kiev in 3 days. To prevent a crisis or a war, French President Emmanuel Macron is set to hold talks in Moscow today, and President Joe Biden will meet with the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz in Washington. Also in Washington on Capitol Hill, work is underway on legislation aimed at crippling Russia's economy should the Kremlin invade Ukraine. As national security correspondent Caitlin Burke reports, there are questions as to whether these unprecedented sanctions could go far enough.
If Russia chooses to invade Ukraine, the financial cost would be extremely high. Senate Republicans and Democrats are working together on a sanctions package they believe could deal a devastating blow.
It's to include a variety of elements, massive sanctions against the most significant Russian banks, crippling to their economy, meaningful in terms of consequences to the average Russian and their accounts and pensions.
According to Senator Menendez, these sanctions go beyond any ever levied, although some experts worry they don't go far enough.
And I do think the sanctions that they're discussing are important, but I don't know that by themselves it is sufficient to cause the kind of effect on the Russian economy that is going to be needed if we are to truly make Putin think twice.
Marshall Billingsley, former Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing at the Treasury Department, says U.S. sanctions should go after 4 key Russian exports.
And here I'm talking about timber. I'm talking about machinery parts and tools. We don't buy any of this stuff really from Russia and the U.S., but they do export it around to Europe. I'm talking about metals and other kinds of chemical products like fertilizers and plastics.
According to Billingsley, those 4 sectors account for about 30% of the extra money Russia brings in each year. He believes targeting them would cause a massive inflation spike and potentially jeopardize Putin's power. Billingsley argues rather than waiting to respond to an invasion, the Biden administration needs to act now.
Because the financial ripples that would create would be immediately felt in Moscow, and it might cause him to take a step back and reconsider.
As the U.S. prepares for various scenarios, a growing number of Americans wonder why we should be involved at all. Billingsley points to Russia's role as a major energy exporter.
If they invade and then sanctions, even sanctions on banks, would have the effect of disrupting the energy trade, and we will see an immediate spike in gas prices at the pump.
There's also the fact that Ukraine is one of the world's leading exporters of things Americans use on a daily basis, like wheat, potatoes, and tomatoes.
The last thing we need is a scramble around the world to buy potatoes because the Russian potato farms are now or the Ukrainian potato farms are now under Russian occupation, and the farmers have all fled.
Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo emphasized the same point.
Almost a third of the wheat, red winter wheat that travels across the world, comes out of Ukraine and Russia and goes through the Black Sea, the very thing that is being threatened by Vladimir Putin. These things matter to the global food supply. If you're living in the outskirts of Las Vegas or Bakersfield or in Tennessee or Georgia or in the upper Midwest, you depend on these stable food supplies.
Finally, Billingsley points to the U.S. long-standing commitment for democracy.
This discussion about letting the democratic country of Ukraine fall prey to a dictator like Vladimir Putin is not what we as Americans should stand for.
As lawmakers work to finalize their sanctions package, Billingsley warns that unprecedented acts of aggression warrant a truly unprecedented response. Caitlin Burke, CBN News.
Caitlin, thank you. The mayor of Canada's capital, Ottawa, declared a state of emergency Sunday as protesters opposed to COVID-19 restrictions continued to paralyze Ottawa's downtown. Thousands of protesters descended again this weekend, joining 100 who remained since last weekend. The protests started with truckers against a new rule: they must be vaccinated against COVID-19 to cross the border into the United States. Protesters have said they will not leave until all mandates and COVID-19 restrictions are gone. Here in the United States, new daily COVID cases have dropped 61% since the peak. Now, some health experts are talking about what's called the new normal, a future where COVID could become more endemic rather than pandemic, much like the flu. They're also calling for better vaccines to fight the variants. Still, some experts continue to expect the virus to mutate, and some fear the possibility of a 1-2 punch, a variant as deadly as Delta and as contagious as Omicron. Medical reporter Lori Johnson has the story.
Many Americans, weary after 2 years of fighting COVID, are resigning themselves to a future that involves living alongside the disease indefinitely. A new survey shows 75% in the U.S. are tired of the pandemic, and 77% believe most people will eventually get the virus. Still, a third of those surveyed see the pandemic as the country's biggest problem.
But I'm hopeful that we're going to get to a better place in the coming months.
Dr. Stuart Ray of Johns Hopkins put that hope in part on the end of the Omicron surge. The infectious disease specialist is one of many experts who believe it may signal a shift from COVID being a pandemic to an endemic. That means it would become like dealing with the flu, a deadly disease in our midst without major disruptions to daily life.
Tuberculosis and malaria are endemic in some countries and have devastating effects. Millions of people die every year from these endemic diseases. So just because something's endemic doesn't mean it's mild.
Experts point to the need for better vaccines.
It looks like in the coming months, we're going to hear about the results of a Omicron antigen vaccine, which will probably be combined with one of the ancestral vaccine antigens. And so that combination may provide better, broader coverage.
Right now, it's nearly impossible to get certain treatments, and that needs to change.
I hope that we'll be able to make those agents more available to people everywhere.
As the coronavirus mutates, it tends to become more contagious, according to Duke Health's Dr. Jonathan Quick, author of The End of Epidemics.
The last 2 years have been stunning as we've seen this progression of variants.
Often, like with Omicron, more transmissible variants are less deadly, but that's another thing you can't count on.
But what would be really unfortunate if after all of the current viral activity that's going on with Omicron, we had a variant, and there's no reason why we couldn't, that combines both the contagiousness of Omicron and the deadliness of Delta.
So while COVID-19 remains unpredictable, health officials are cautiously optimistic that we'll see this transition to an endemic. While that means future surges could be likely, hopefully major restrictions will be less so. Lori Johnson, CBN News.
Coming up, growing concern over Iran's nuclear program and the possibility Israel could launch a preemptive strike to take it out. Find out why some experts think it's likely and whether they believe Israel has the power to pull it off. Welcome back to CBN NewsWatch. Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett warned his cabinet Sunday the latest Iran nuclear deal being negotiated by the Biden administration from the United States and other world powers will make it harder to deal with Iran's nuclear program. Observers have speculated for years about the possibility of Israel launching a preemptive strike against Iran. One Israeli analyst has studied the issue for more than a decade. He has a dire warning about the devastating consequences such action might bring. Chris Mitchell brings us the story.
In 2012, Yaakov Katz, now the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post, served as the paper's defense analyst. As co-author of Israel versus Iran, The Shadow War, he examined the potential for an attack on Iran's nuclear program.
It seemed at the time that Israel was capable of doing it. I distinctly remember one meeting that I was brought into at the Air Force headquarters in Tel Aviv with the top Air Force general who basically laid out, rolled out a map on a table and showed us how the Israeli Air Force squadrons would fly to Iran.
At the time, Israel prepared night and day.
The Air Force had been training extensively for this operation. Billions and billions of shekels had been poured in to this planning and to training and to buying up the munitions and the technology and the weapons that would be needed to take out some of the facilities.
Then Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Ehud Barak tried but failed to convince the cabinet, army and security chiefs to take action.
In the end, that never happened. So that was the backdrop back in 2012. And it seemed real, it seemed viable, and it seemed like Israel had a real opportunity to cause enough damage to set back Iran's nuclear program.
Now, 10 years later, the problem and targets remain the same. Natanz, Iran's main uranium enrichment facility. Fordow, with thousands of centrifuges burrowed into a mountain. To the west, Iraq, where a heavy water plutonium facility is under construction. And further south, Iran's uranium conversion facility in Isfahan. Since this scenario hasn't changed in 10 years, what about Israel's military capability?
Israel today, Chris, is stronger than it was back in 2012, right? If back in 2012 we had F-15s and F-16s, those are fourth generation fighter jets that are detectable on radar. Today we have F-35s. These are the JSF, the Joint Strike Fighters, that have stealth flight capabilities that can basically go fly into enemy airspace, not be detected, and can take out radar installations as well as surface-to-air missile systems, can basically pave the way for then the big heavy bombers, the F-15s and the F-16s, to come in and drop a ton of munitions all over these different facilities to destroy them.
The question a lot of people have been asking over and over again throughout the years, can Israel do it?
Well, I think it's a little more complicated today, Chris. I think that back in 2012, the feeling was that, yes, it could do it. Then Iran's nuclear program is not as advanced as it is today. It was not as heavily fortified as it is today. It was not as dispersed as it is today. With that said, even then, it would have been just causing enough damage to set them back for a period of time.
Middle East expert Joel Rosenberg laid out a number of top stories to look at in 2022. At the top of the list, an Israeli attack on Iran.
We've never had to do it before. We've always found a way through covert operations and all kinds of other shadow activities to keep Iran from getting the bomb without having to go to what's called a kinetic war, a full-on actual war.
Katz points out even if there were an attack, it wouldn't be the end of the story.
And I think that no one has any illusion to believe that if Israel attacks Iran, that's it. There's never going to be a nuclear program. No, there can be, because the Iranians have the domestic know-how, they have the technology, it's in their heads. And while you can destroy their facilities and infrastructure, you can't take away that knowledge.
Plus, any military move likely leads to a regional war, with Iran unleashing Hezbollah, its arm in Lebanon, to fire thousands of missiles into Israel.
That is not a war we want to be in. We might have to do it, but I mean, those stakes are just so high, and I think to me, that's the far away the biggest story.
I think that Israel has means at its disposal. The question, though, comes down to, is it worth it? Is the damage that you will cause Iran's nuclear infrastructure going to be worth the war that will ensue, the international condemnations that you will almost definitely face from the world?
It's an age-old dilemma that now faces a new set of Israeli leaders.
I don't think Israel can live with a nuclear Iran, right? I think a nuclear Iran has the potential to pose an existential threat to the state of Israel. So it's not like I'm saying we should just sit back and let this happen. No, we have to do what we have to do, but we also have to realize that sometimes power has its limits. So it's complicated.
As Israeli military and political leaders increasingly warn about a looming attack, Rosenberg believes Israel's options are running out.
I don't hear it as hyperbolic. I don't hear it as trying to, be sensationalistic. I think Israeli leaders are realizing this is it. Iran has gone past all of the previous red lines that any Israeli government has ever said. But no Israeli prime minister wants to go to war.
The threat, sadly, is still there, and it needs to be dealt with. I would hope and pray that it can be dealt without the use of force, without the need for war and bloodshed. That is always the Israeli and Jewish preference, right? Is to be able to do this through peaceful means, through dialogue, through discussion, through a deal. But unfortunately, we are dealing with a murderous regime that has so much blood on its hands that it's only seeking and hungry for more. And that's why it needs to be stopped.
And another part of history also remains, as Katz points out, often the Jewish people stand alone.
That famous saying of Hillel the Elder, a Jewish scholar from the period of the Talmud from a couple thousand years ago, who said back in the time in Hebrew, "Eina nidli mili," which translates into English, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? And what was true thousands of years ago for the Jewish people is still so true in the year 2022.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Still ahead, inside a safe home for single mothers, a place that's showing Christians how to care for pregnant women in a world that could come about if Roe versus Wade is overturned and abortion is outlawed in many states. We're going to take a look at the Blue Haven Ranch right after this. Beth is a single mother of two who became pregnant during the pandemic. She had nowhere to turn for help until she found a haven for mothers in crisis. Blue Haven Ranch is a prime example of how the church can be a safety net for women in need. CBN's Charlene Aaron brings us the story.
From housing and meals to financial assistance, Blue Haven Ranch hopes to help single pregnant mothers work through past trauma and emotions in an atmosphere that fosters healing and a fresh start. Aubrey Schlackman says God gave her the idea for Blue Haven Ranch 2 years ago, an answer to a desire she and her husband had been praying about for years.
We've been involved in different ministries, but then we've also had a big heart for single pregnant mothers for a long time.
The mission of the maternity ranch in Argyle, Texas, will be to provide a supportive community for these mothers, complete with counseling and gospel-centered discipleship.
That's what we're called to do as followers of Christ, is to love God and love others and make disciples.
Schlackman says that the ranch, intended to house moms in individual cottages, will take time to build. Still, the couple felt the needs of pregnant mothers and their children couldn't wait, so they made the decision to start the ministry out of their home.
We knew we could take moms that already had current housing and then they were in a safe situation, and then bring them into a Bible study and a support group structure in our home. We would all cook meals together, send them home with the meals.
Part of the plan includes teaching the mothers simple farming techniques as a form of therapy to work through emotional wounds.
We have a greenhouse in our backyard, and we started and learned how to grow produce organically, hydroponically, with water channels and stuff. We got chickens and we raise eggs.
The ministry is now expanding beyond the family's home.
We have 5 moms now. Basically, we house them in rent homes and apartment complexes, and we pay for their rent and the utilities associated with that rent.
Many see this work as a model for how the church can assist pregnant moms at a time when abortion could be outlawed in America. At this year's March for Life, conservatives voiced optimism that the landmark ruling of Roe versus Wade will be overturned.
Hopefully, next year, we'll be in a new era of building a culture of life, because Roe will be gone.
Schlackman believes with the current Texas heartbeat law, which bans abortions once a fetal heartbeat is detected, that the need to serve these mothers is greater than ever.
Being able to offer them this safety net and that space to kind of come into a community that loves them, that supports them, and sees them for who they are, and then embraces them and empowers them to be better moms once they leave the program and better equipped.
Beth was a hardworking single mother of 2 when she became pregnant again at the height of the pandemic. Unsure of how she would provide for her growing family, she turned to Blue Haven.
And I was feeling damaged and punished, but I knew that I wanted this positive change for my life, for my family, for my 2 older children, for their sakes, if for anything. I felt comfortable right off the bat. I feel more powerful, especially when they pray over me. I really love that part.
Schlackman says it's rewarding to see the ministry's impact.
And just hearing back from some of our moms who came out of some pretty desperate circumstances and even abusive situations, that now they feel safe and their children are safe and they feel loved and welcomed. And even despite the fact that some of them are not believers, they feel welcomed and loved and cared for, and not oppressed.
A fundraising campaign for the actual Ranch for Women is currently underway. Until then, Schlackman says the ministry will continue making a difference, one mom at a time. Charlene Aaron, CBN News.
Coming up, we'll have an encouraging word to start your week. Stay with us. Time now for your Monday motivation, and today I want to leave you with this thought. Stop looking to the right and to the left, being consumed by what others are doing. Comparison is the enemy of authenticity. You be you and stay in your lane. It isn't crowded. In fact, you're the only one on it. With that word, make this a marvelous Monday and be sure to have yourself a wonderful rest of the week. Well, that will do it for this edition of CBN Newswatch. You can always find more of our news programs on the CBN News Channel. You can also find them online at any time at cbnnews.com. Let us know what you think about the stories you've seen here today or any day. You can email us. The address is right there at the bottom of your screen, newswatch@cbn.com. And of course, you can always reach out and touch us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Hope you'll join us again right back here, same time tomorrow. Goodbye and God bless.